The first time my neighbor smiled at me, he was grinding my property marker into the dirt with the heel of his work boot. He looked down like it was nothing more than a cheap wooden stick, then back at me with that little grin people wear when they think they've already won. "Go ahead," he said. "Prove where the line is now." I looked at the phone in my hand, still recording every second, then back at him and shrugged. "I already did." He laughed so hard he had to wipe his eyes. "And if you had walked by right then, you probably would have thought I was the one getting embarrassed." What nobody on that street understood yet was that I had spent almost 3 decades making my living proving exactly where invisible lines belonged. And the man standing in front of me had just handed me the strongest piece of evidence I could have asked for without even realizing it. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for 27 years I've worked as a licensed land surveyor around central Kentucky. Most people only think about surveyors when they're buying a house or arguing over a fence. But my job has always been about something much quieter than that. I help settle disagreements before they become lawsuits. I spend my days reading century-old deeds, digging for iron pins buried under decades of soil, matching faded courthouse records with GPS equipment that costs more than most pickup trucks. You learn patience in this line of work. You also learn that property disputes are almost never about dirt. They're about pride. That's something my neighbor, Wade Collins, never understood. Wade had moved into the neighborhood about 4 years earlier after selling a construction business outside Louisville. Nice truck, expensive toys, loud opinions about everything. The kind of guy who'd wave at you one day, then tell everyone at the hardware store how your grass wasn't cut straight enough the next. We weren't enemies. Not at first. We barely talked. A quick morning wave, maybe a nod while getting the mail. Nothing more. My wife used to tell me, "Just let him be, Dan. Some people need an audience." I usually listened. Life's too short to argue with people who enjoy arguing. Then last spring, my wife spent several weeks helping our daughter after the birth of our first grandchild, and I accepted a surveying contract in another county that kept me away from home most weekdays. When I finally came back for good, something immediately felt off. Surveyors develop strange instincts after enough years. Most folks look at a backyard and see grass, fences, trees. I see grades, drainage, corners, alignments. Walking into my own yard that afternoon felt like reading a sentence where somebody had quietly changed 3 words. The slope near the property line wasn't right anymore. Rainwater was flowing differently. The flower bed I planted years earlier looked narrower than I remembered. Then I saw it. A brand new retaining wall stretched across the edge of Wade's backyard. Clean concrete blocks stacked with professional precision, almost 18 feet long. At first glance, it looked impressive. At second glance, my stomach tightened. I walked into the garage, pulled out my old survey records, then compared them to the county plat I'd filed away years before. I didn't even need my instruments to know something wasn't adding up. The next morning, I came back with my equipment anyway. GPS receiver, total station, original subdivision documents. Within 2 hours, I had the answer. Wade's new retaining wall wasn't sitting entirely on his property. Nearly 2 feet of it crossed onto mine. Now, if you're thinking 2 feet doesn't sound like much, you're not alone. That's exactly how most people think. But ownership doesn't become optional because the number is small. If someone parks their car halfway inside your garage every day, eventually it stops being about the parking space. It becomes about respect. I figured maybe it had been an honest mistake. Contractors misread old stakes all the time. So that afternoon, I walked over carrying copies of the survey instead of a lawyer's letter. Wade was washing his truck when I reached the driveway. "Hey," I said. "Got a minute?" He looked up, smiled politely enough, and walked over. I showed him the map, pointed out the monuments, explained exactly where the property corner sat. "Looks like your retaining wall crossed onto my lot by about 23 inches. He barely glanced at the paperwork before handing it back. "Nah," I blinked. "Nah? Those old maps are probably wrong. County records don't really work that way." He shrugged. "Close enough." I remember standing there wondering if he genuinely believed property boundaries changed just because they became inconvenient. I stayed calm. "I'm not asking you to tear anything down today. I'm just letting you know before this turns into a bigger problem." He folded his arms. "Problem for who? Both of us if we ignore it." He laughed under his breath. "Nobody cares about 2 feet of dirt, Dan." I smiled, though I could already feel the conversation slipping away. "Property lines don't expire, Wade. People just hope nobody checks." His expression hardened for the first time. "Well, I guess you checked. That's my job." He took one step closer. Then here's my advice. Stop checking. I walked home without saying another word because experience had taught me something that younger surveyors often learn the hard way. Once someone decides facts are personal insults, no amount of explaining changes their mind. Evidence has to do the talking. 3 mornings later, a licensed survey crew I trusted arrived just after sunrise. We reset every corner using current GPS data and original subdivision control points. Drove fresh steel pins where needed. Tapped them with bright orange survey markers. Photographed everything from multiple angles, and documented every measurement. By lunchtime, the property line was clearer than it had ever been since the subdivision was built. I wasn't trying to provoke Wade. I was preserving the truth before it disappeared. Around 8 the next morning, I heard the rumble of diesel outside my kitchen window. Wade was driving a compact excavator straight toward the property line, the bucket hanging low as it rolled closer to those bright orange caps. And something told me the conversation we'd started a few days earlier was about to become something none of the neighbors would ever forget. I stepped onto the porch just as Wade climbed out of the excavator, coffee cup in one hand, sunglasses hiding his eyes, even though the morning sun was barely over the trees. The engine kept idling behind him, that slow diesel rumble filling the otherwise quiet neighborhood. He nodded toward the fresh orange survey caps like they were trash somebody had forgotten to pick up. "Move your little flags," he called out, "or the machine's gonna move them for you." I looked at the camera clipped to my shirt, made sure the recording light was blinking, then answered the same way I would have answered anyone standing on a job site. "Those aren't decorations, Wade. They're legal survey monuments." He smirked. "They're plastic caps. They're evidence." For a second, neither of us moved. The only sound was the excavator humming beside him. Then he climbed back into the cab, eased the bucket forward, and let it hover over the property line. I honestly believe that moment said more about his personality than every conversation we'd ever had. It wasn't about the wall anymore. It wasn't even about the land. It was about proving that nobody could tell him where to stop. The bucket dipped just enough to scrape the grass on his side before stopping inches from the nearest marker. He looked down at me through the windshield and grinned. "See? Didn't touch your dirt." I simply nodded. Good decision. That seemed to irritate him more than if I'd yelled. People like Wade expect anger because anger gives them something to fight. Calmness makes them feel like they're losing a game they don't understand. He shot the excavator down with more force than necessary, jumped out, and walked toward me carrying the certified letter I'd mailed 2 days earlier requesting that we address the encroachment. Without saying a word, he ripped it clean in half and dropped the pieces at my feet. "There's your answer," he said. "Sue me. I'll bury you in lawyers before you ever move an inch of that wall." Then he turned around and walked back into his yard as if the conversation had ended exactly the way he'd planned. I waited until he closed his back door before picking up the torn envelope, slipping both pieces into a folder, and walking inside. My wife, Karen, looked up from the kitchen table where she'd been sorting photos from our granddaughter's first birthday. "How bad?" she asked quietly. I smiled in spite of myself. "Better than I expected." She raised an eyebrow. "Really? He just documented refusal, destroyed certified correspondence, threatened litigation on camera, and confirmed he knows exactly where the dispute is." She stared at me for a second before laughing. Only you could sound excited after getting threatened. Maybe she was right. Surveying teaches you to separate emotion from evidence. Feelings disappear. Documentation lasts forever. That afternoon, I organized everything into a case file the same way I'd done for hundreds of clients over the years. Original subdivision plat, current survey, GPS coordinate logs, drone photographs, ground photographs, video recordings, copies of county records dating back to 1994. Every conversation summarized with dates and times while they were still fresh in my mind. People always imagine lawsuits beginning with dramatic courtroom speeches, but most of them actually begin with somebody quietly building an organized folder in their home office. 2 days later, I mailed another packet, this time addressed to Wade's attorney whose name appeared on several construction filings I'd found in county records. I wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. I simply wanted every responsible person to know exactly what existed before the situation became expensive. 4 days after that, my phone rang while I was staking a subdivision outside Frankfurt. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Rebecca Lawson, counsel for Wade Collins. Her voice was calm, professional, completely different from Wade's. "Mr. Patient Mercer," she began. "My client would like to discuss a possible resolution." I leaned against the tailgate of my truck and smiled without realizing it. "I'm listening." There was a short pause before she continued. Would you consider allowing the retaining wall to remain? That question alone told me she'd already reviewed the survey and understood what her client hadn't. That depends, I answered. On what? Whether your client wants convenience or ownership. Another pause. Can you explain? Removing the wall now means excavation, drainage repairs, patio reconstruction, foundation stabilization, landscaping, permits, inspections. Best estimate is somewhere north of $20,000 before anyone even plants new grass. She let out the kind of quiet breath lawyers make when they already know you're right. You've run the numbers several times, and your proposal? The wall stays exactly where it is. Silence. Long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, she asked, why? I laughed softly. Because the wall isn't my problem. The location is. We spent almost 40 minutes discussing possibilities. Easement? No. Permanent land transfer? Absolutely not. Shared maintenance agreement? Also no. Then I explained the only option I considered fair. Wade could lease the occupied strip of land for as long as the retaining wall remained on my property. Back rent would compensate for the unauthorized occupation since construction had finished months earlier. Future monthly payments would continue until the encroachment ended. It wasn't punishment. It was simply recognizing that someone was using land they didn't own. Rebecca never argued with the principal. She only asked for numbers. That evening, I sat at my desk with a calculator, comparable land values, local appraisal data, and enough paperwork to cover half the dining room table. The back compensation came to $19,200 based on the specific circumstances, restoration cost avoided, and negotiated value of continued occupation. The monthly lease payment settled at $320. Karen looked over my shoulder while I printed the documents. Do you think he'll ever agree to this? She asked. I smiled. No. Then why write it? Because his lawyer might. The following Monday, 2 black SUVs pulled into my driveway just after 10 in the morning. Rebecca stepped out of one. Wade climbed out of the other, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Gone was the swagger. Gone were the sunglasses. His face carried that exhausted expression people get after finally hearing the truth from someone they can't bully. We sat around my dining room table while Rebecca carefully reviewed every page. Wade barely looked at me. When she finished, he finally broke the silence. You're charging me rent. For my own wall? I folded my hands together. No, I'm charging you rent for my land. He shook his head in disbelief. This is insane. Tearing it down is expensive. This is cheaper. He leaned forward. You planned this. I couldn't help smiling a little. No, Wade. You planned the wall. I planned for what happened after. His jaw tightened. You're robbing me. I met his eyes without raising my voice. Robbery is taking something that belongs to someone else. Rent is paying for using it. Rebecca quietly slid the agreement toward him. Legally speaking, she said, Mr. Mercer is offering a significantly less expensive resolution than litigation or demolition. Wade looked at her like she'd betrayed him. Whose side are you on? She answered with remarkable honesty. The side that costs you the least. Through the dining room window, I noticed movement across the street. Mrs. Alvarez was pretending to water flowers that definitely didn't need watering. Old Mr. Jenkins was checking his mailbox for the 3rd time in 20 minutes. A teenager riding his bike slowed almost to a stop before continuing down the block. Small neighborhoods always know when history is being written, even if nobody says a word. Wade stared at the papers for what felt like forever. His shoulders, once always squared with confidence, seemed noticeably lower than they had a week earlier. I realized then that pride isn't usually destroyed all at once. It wears down quietly when reality refuses to negotiate. He picked up the pen, turned it between his fingers, then looked at me one last time. If I sign this, he said slowly, you're really going to let the wall stay, as long as the agreement is honored. He looked down at the signature line again, and for the first time since this entire mess had started, the loudest man in the neighborhood had absolutely nothing left to say. The room stayed quiet for several long seconds before Wade finally lowered the pen to the paper. His signature wasn't neat anymore. The confident, oversized handwriting I'd seen on neighborhood petitions and HOA meeting notes had been replaced by something smaller, slower, almost hesitant. He slid the agreement across the table without looking at me. Rebecca gathered the documents, thanked both of us for handling the matter professionally, and left us sitting there together in complete silence. Wade stood, tucked his hands into his jacket pockets, and stopped at the front door. You're really not going to make me tear it down? He asked one last time. I shook my head. I never wanted your wall. Wade, I just wanted my property respected. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then walked outside. Through the window, I watched him climb into his truck, while the neighbors casually pretended they hadn't spent the last hour trying to figure out what was happening inside my house. Mrs. Alvarez suddenly became very interested in trimming a rose bush. Mr. Jenkins somehow found another reason to stand by his mailbox. It made me laugh because that's how neighborhoods work. Everybody says they mind their own business until something unusual happens 2 doors down. By the first of the following month, $320 landed in my bank account right before lunchtime. No note, no apology, just the transfer. I showed Karen the notification on my phone, and she smiled before shaking her head. You know, she said, I honestly didn't think he'd pay. Neither did I admitted. But his lawyer probably reminded him what the alternative costs. Sure enough, the payment came again the next month. Then, the month after that, it became strangely ordinary. Every first of the month, I'd be making coffee or reading the morning news when my phone would buzz with a deposit notification. At some point, it stopped feeling like a victory and started feeling like the natural consequence of a decision Wade had made all by himself. The funny part was how dramatically his behavior changed. Before all this, he'd mow his lawn in wide, careless loops that crossed back and forth near the property line without a second thought. Now he treated those bright orange survey caps like they were an electric fence. His mower would stop inches away, back up, straighten out, then continue in the opposite direction. If one of his grandkids wandered too close while they were playing catch, he'd call them back immediately. Stay on this side, I'd hear him say. Don't cross the markers. Every single time, I had to smile a little. The same man who once insisted property lines didn't matter had become the most careful person on the street about respecting them. A few months later, we crossed paths at the local hardware store. It was the first real conversation we'd had since he signed the lease. We both reached for the same box of deck screws and paused. He chuckled awkwardly. Guess you can have them, he said. I've cost you enough already. I laughed. Genuinely this time. We're probably the only two people in Kentucky who can turn retaining walls into small talk. He actually smiled, not the smug grin I'd grown used to, but a tired, honest smile that seemed to belong to a different man. You know, he said after a moment, I should have listened the first day you came over with those papers. I looked at him for a second before answering. Probably. He nodded. I kept thinking, if I admitted I was wrong, I'd look weak. Most expensive lesson you ever bought? He let out a laugh. Not even close. My pride cost a whole lot more than $320 a month. We stood there talking for another 10 minutes about fishing, retirement, and the endless road construction outside town. It wasn't friendship. Not exactly. But it wasn't hostility anymore either. Sometimes the best ending isn't watching someone lose. Sometimes it's watching someone finally learn. Looking back now, people often ask me if I planned the whole thing from the beginning. They imagine I had some clever strategy tucked away in my back pocket, waiting for the perfect moment to spring it on my neighbor. The truth is much simpler. I never wanted a monthly payment. I never wanted leverage. I never wanted a legal agreement sitting in my filing cabinet with Wade's signature across the bottom. What I wanted was the same thing I'd wanted on the very first afternoon I walked across the yard carrying those survey maps. A simple conversation between two neighbors who respected each other's property. But respect can't be forced. Sometimes people only understand boundaries after ignoring them becomes more expensive than honoring them. That retaining wall is still standing today, exactly where it has always been, crossing just enough onto my property to remind both of us how quickly arrogance can turn into obligation. The orange survey caps have faded a little from years of sun and rain, but they're still there too, marking a line that was never really about dirt. It was about accountability. Every now and then, a new neighbor asks why those markers have never been removed, and I just smile and tell them they're part of a long story. Wade usually hears that, chuckles from across the fence, and says, "Trust me, leave those stakes alone." We both laugh now because time has a funny way of sanding down sharp edges that anger never could. So let me ask you this. If you were in my position, would you have demanded the wall be demolished, no matter the cost? Or would you have done exactly what I did and turned a bad decision into a long-term lesson instead? And if you were in Wade's shoes, at what point would you have admitted you were wrong? I'd really like to hear where you draw that line. Because property disputes are rarely just about land. They're about pride, respect, and the choices we make when someone quietly tells us we've crossed a boundary. If this story made you think, share your opinion in the comments. And don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join us for more neighborhood conflicts where patience, evidence, and a little common sense end up speaking louder than the loudest person on the block.